All right, so this next little module is all about how to talk about organisms. Of course, you might start by saying, well, the organism has a name, let's use it. And yes, ecologists are definitely for that. But we have a whole pile of other terms that help us understand the role of that organism in its environment as well. So let's talk about that. Just as in any form of biological science, organisms in ecology can be classified based on their phylogenetic relationships. So we rely heavily on evolutionary biologists, specifically systematists, to tell us what organism we're working with. But this isn't the only way that ecologists um, group uh, organisms. I think it's important for you to understand from this image on the right that we do really think very carefully about what kind of organism we're thinking about. We think very carefully about the fact that we are working with primary producers or plants versus organisms that are consumers of other organisms. And so we'll talk about that in a bit, but it's very important that you understand you're welcome to use species names and major classifications like plants, animals, fungi, algae, protists, bacteria, archaea. All of that is incredibly important to us. But organisms can also be classified based on how they acquire energy. And so we will have producers or primary producers, sometimes you'll hear. A producer is an organism that uses photosynthesis to convert solar energy into organic compounds, or uses chemosynthesis to convert chemical energy into organic compounds. Producers are also commonly referred to as autotrophs, so you'll see that word as well. We also have consumers. They're organisms that obtain their energy from other organisms, and they're also known as heterotrophs. Now, something you may not have heard about too much are the mixotrophs, where these are organisms that obtain their energy from more than one source. They may be both photosynthetic and consume something else. It's kind of wild to imagine. There are many algae that are like this, and there are some protists, plants, and animals that are also like this. It's kind of wild. Now, organisms can be classified, when we're thinking about what they're consuming, it can be based on how they interact with those other organisms. So a predator is an organism that kills and partially or entirely consumes another individual. A parasitoid, right down here, so this thing, these little white things on a caterpillar, are organisms that live within and consume the tissues of a living host that eventually kill it. Parasites, so like a tick, are organisms that live and feed in or on another organism, but they rarely kill their host. So parasitoids do kill their host, parasites rarely do. A pathogen, you might have heard that term. Pathogens are parasites that cause disease in their host. And then finally, we have herbivores that are organisms that can consume primary producers such as plants and algae. Now, symbiotic relationships that term symbiotic relationship is when two different types of organisms live in close physical relationships. So they have to really touch, basically, on a very regular basis in order for us to consider it symbiotic. There are different types of symbiotic relationships, and they can have positive or negative consequences. They can even have no consequences. So let's go through a couple common ones just so you get an idea of what's going on. So competition is an interaction that results in negative effects between two species that depend on the same limiting resource to survive, grow, and reproduce. So this could be like two different types of grasses. They might be competing for the same resources. A mutualism is an interaction between two species in which each species receives a benefit from the other. So you can see they're both positive here. The competition was both negative. Commensalism is an interaction in which two species live in close association and one species receives a benefit while the other species receives neither benefit nor a cost. In the case of predation, parasitism, and parasitoidism and herbivory, in all of these cases, one species benefits and the other species is hurt. But we've already talked about what their definitions are above. I wanted to point out on the right-hand side here, what you're seeing is lichen, and in lichen there's both fungal hyphae as well as algal cells that are living in very close association with each other. It's kind of cool. There are some waste recyclers that I didn't mention in that last table, in part because they're all commensalists, but they're kind of a weird commensalist. So the waste recyclers that we think about and discuss are scavengers, which are organisms that consume dead animals, detritivores, which is an organism that feeds on dead organic matter and waste products. So that's collectively known as detritus. So notice how a scavenger will eat a dead animal, but detritivore will not eat a dead animal unless it's dead, really organic-y matter, right? Like it has to be pretty organic, or it could be waste products, so like manure. And then a decomposer breaks down dead organic material into simpler elements and compounds that can be recycled through the ecosystem. All three of these groups are incredibly important to nutrient cycling in ecosystems. Okay, so the next and last question I want to ask in this little video is, where do organisms live? And I know that earlier in this module we've talked about geographic distribution and range, and this is a different question. So when I'm talking about where do organisms live, in some cases it's about geographic distribution, but in this particular situation I want to talk about two terms, habitat and niche. The habitat is the place or the physical setting in which an organism lives. And you can see on the right-hand side here some habitats. Here's a riverine habitat, right? Here is a tropical forest habitat. Here is a glacial lake habitat. And here is a grassland habitat, okay? Or a savanna habitat. Habitat differs from niche because while this zebra could live in this habitat, it probably has a wider range of tolerances. It probably could live in this little bit of scrub right back here too, right? So the range of a niche is a range of abiotic and biotic conditions that an organism can tolerate. So this might include the temperature, the soil type, the vegetation for that zebra. The interesting thing is that no two species have the same niche because each has a unique phenotype that determines the conditions that it can tolerate. And I'm going to show you this in a different image here. So here are two niches. So these are two borers on corn or beans or cabbage. So you can see corn at the back, and here is a corn borer, and it can live within the agricultural habitat of a cornfield or a vegetable garden, but it has to live on this particular plant. Here is a beetle that needs to live on beans, right? Even though it's right beside the corn and it might land on the corn, it will not be happy to live on the corn. And then finally on the cabbage, you can see this beautiful caterpillar. It's the bane of my existence, but it is the cabbage white butterfly. It's the caterpillar of that. And they cannot live, they're obligate on crucifery or brassicas. So these organisms do not live in the same niche because they have these phenotypes that are unique to that species and that determine the conditions under which it can tolerate. So they all live in the same habitat, that is a garden, but they do not live in the same niche. And with that, I'm going to end here, and there's one more video for you to watch this week.